Hi, my name is Kelsey Fikowski, and I'm going to be reviewing the entire AP course and curriculum as outlined by the College Board. I'm going to first start off with the very first unit of which is called Constitutional Underpinnings and provide you a general overview of government in America. I'll also be throwing in review questions, some of which have been on previous AP U.S. government examinations. So, as a general introduction, certainly politics and government matter in many ways, that everybody is affected by politics in some way, whether it's taxes, whether you're fighting in a war, whether or not a local park is built. That all boils down to politics, whether it's at the local, state, or national levels. And when we look at the levels of engagement amongst Americans, generally speaking, it's apathetic when compared to modernized, industrialized countries, especially in Europe. And really where we see the apathy comes from younger people. And I think something, the chart that really demonstrates this the most is during presidential elections, when you think the turnout is really at its highest. Well, if you're under the age of 25 and those who can vote, you see that it's relatively stagnant and lackluster, does not really, hasn't gotten really above 42, 44% since the 1992 election, certainly, and other elections much, much lower. But you do see that older people tend to vote at higher rates, and there are many reasons for that, which we'll get to in subsequent chapters and units. But nevertheless, something to think about how politics impacts you, even if you're just a student, if you're 12, 13, 14. For example, whether or not, a particular program at school gets funded, that is impacted by politics. You most likely have a board of education in your town, and that decides, at the end of the day, whether something gets funded or whether something does not. And it impacts everybody. It's not just people who can vote. Everybody who's born from day one up until the day you die, you are undoubtedly impacted. So when we look at politics, we're looking at the policies that are produced by our government leaders. And these policies impact public issues. A good way to think about this is who gets what, when, and how. If you think about it, there's only a certain amount of money that can go around that can certainly fund programs or allow for roads to get built. Well, our politicians who we elect are in charge of that, and they are deciding what, if it's going to be a road, when will that be funded, and how much of it. So when you really look at politics, I think this is a great definition: who gets what, when, and how. Certainly politicians have a lot of power in that way. And when we look at this term of political power, two major components of this are the authority, the right to use that power, and legitimacy, that political authority conferred by law or by a state or national constitution, that you belong there, that people respect that power, that power, you have the ability of one person to get another person to act in accordance, in this little tricky, complicated definition. But certainly authority and legitimacy really are the backbones to a democratic republic, and we've seen this to be work relatively well since the Constitution was devised. So when we look at a government, you have to look at these two basic questions: how should we govern, and what should government do? And especially the latter, what should government do, I think is such a big question that you see Republicans and Democrats fighting about constantly. Democrats typically want more increased spending for social programs, whereas Republicans typically don't, except when it comes to the military. So you have ideological battles as to what role the government should play, and these are things that have evolved over time since the Washington presidency, and we are still toiling now and will continue to. But typically when we look at governments, they're very much responsible for national defense, very important, providing services, and the extent to what those services are. Should it be healthcare? Should it not be healthcare? Those again come back to that question: what should government do? Of course, they're collecting taxes, and of course, preserving order, amongst many other responsibilities. So our American government is relatively active if you just look at the amount of money, and some of these numbers are a little bit older from the textbook, about 2009, but nevertheless you get the idea, especially if you adjust for inflation, but for example, owning 2.6 billion square feet of office space just in the United States, owning 400,000 non-military vehicles, owning 1/3 of the land in the United States. If you go to Nevada, for example, most of that is federal land. A very small percent is actually state land owned by Nevada. So certainly government is very active in the United States and plays a major, major role. One thing that is interesting, and you can certainly find this link if you just Google it, is if you just look at the citizenship test as to what we see as important. For example, can you name how many senators there are or members in the House of Representatives? What's interesting is there with the citizenship, how well do you know your government? And again, overall, the intelligence about political knowledge specifically is relatively low compared to other countries, which is very interesting considering, how vocal and how decisive American politics has been over the past decade. So when we look at democracy, and these are, anytime you see these terms italicized, bolded, or underlined, you want to pay particularly close attention. When you look at democracy, just generally speaking, it's the rule of many. Where we have direct or really true democracy, sometimes also called participatory democracies, is in which all citizens participate directly, and you will not find really a direct democracy anywhere. Probably really one of the most famous ones would be Athens. You would not have any politicians. Really, it would be a series of just people going to vote yes or no. So if you had a direct democracy today, it would be, should the tax rate increase? And Americans would vote. And it would come down to what the majority wants, right? That's how really a democracy works. You would not have politicians. So in many senses, in the United States today, we are not a direct democracy at all. We are a representative democracy, or democratic republic, in which citizens are going to be electing leaders to make those decisions on behalf of the people who voted for them. So, think about it. There are some advantages to a representative democracy in the sense that, would you be informed on every single issue from tax policy? If you've ever seen the tax code, we're talking thousands and thousands of pages. Would you be informed about drilling? Would you be informed about, national intelligence? You really wouldn't. And so in some ways, it's helpful that you have politicians in office who can specialize in their full-time job is voting. Now imagine going to the polls and you have no idea what the heck you're voting on because you don't have the time. You have to work. So in some ways there are practical reasons as to why a democratic republic is more advantageous. On the other hand, it has been criticized in the sense that the people are relinquishing some control, and you very much are. But the idea that if you don't agree with the politicians, you could certainly vote them out of office. Now, I ask you this, is a true democracy best? Here is a Pew Research poll, and this is back in 2010, asking Americans whether or not they think Obama is a Muslim, if you recall that major debate. And you have a good percent who either don't know or actually believe that he is a Muslim. In August 2010, 18% believed he was, 43% were unsure, despite the fact that he has produced a birth certificate, that there is evidence that he is indeed an American citizen. And the idea that people might be swayed by things that aren't necessarily true, is that a good thing then if we have a democratic republic? Again, just posing questions, but certainly it raises some interesting ideas here. And even when you look at people's political knowledge, if you look between 1964, when you're going to be getting into the Vietnam era, compared to 2004, when you have the war in Iraq continuing, really the political knowledge over time is going to increase. You see that people under 30 tend to have limited political knowledge, but as you actually go up in age, your political knowledge is going to increase, yet the opposite actually happened in 1964, where you really had the young people most informed in 64, and then as you got older, that they got less informed. But the opposite is true today, that as you get older, the more informed you're going to be. And in some way that's going to make sense, because you're going to be impacted, I would say, more by politics and government as you get older, as you're paying taxes, as you're voting probably more often than you would if you're in college. So you do see that you might be paying a little bit more attention and in turn gain a little bit more political knowledge. So again, you always have to be thinking, is representative democracy best? Certainly key figures that you might want to be aware of, especially John Locke, arguing against powerful kings and in favor of popular consent. Certainly a major role in the Constitution during the Enlightenment period that's going to undoubtedly impact the United States, and we will certainly be getting to that in our constitutional underpinnings unit. Aristotle believing that democracy as ruled by ordinary people, most of whom would be poor. Certainly that would be representative of a true democracy. But on the opposite end, you have Thomas Hobbes, who really did not entrust the common person, actually feared the common person, and that you needed an absolute monarch, essentially, to prevent civil war and to preserve order. So you have various definitions when you look at various historical figures. But when we look at American democracy, there's this traditional sense that comes about when you define American democracy, sort of the idealisms of that, effective participation, the fact that people are going to vote. You can't have a democracy when people aren't going to vote, and that's going to be an issue. Enlightened understanding. Well, you have to be informed about issues, and do people do that? And are the sources that you're using, if it's, Republicansstink.com or Democratsstink.com, are you going to get the most neutral facts involved? So certainly that plays a major part. Equality in voting, making sure that you're not discriminating, making sure that everybody has an equal right to vote. Is everybody included as well? And then lastly, do citizens have some say in the agenda that's going to be set in terms of what policies are going to be produced? Okay, and lastly, for our review question, which example best describes a direct democracy? Is it a monarch is elected by its citizens? Citizens vote for taxes to decrease by 2%. A president is impeached for lying to its citizens. An incumbent is voted out of office, or none of the above. What you will see with every multiple choice question that you encounter on an actual AP Gov exam, that you will have a relatively straightforward question. There are 5 possible answers, and of course only one is the correct one. And if you said the answer is citizens vote for taxes to decrease by 2%, that is an example of a direct or true, or even called a participatory democracy. Because in a true democracy, you have no politicians, you have no one representing you. So you would not have a monarch, you would not have a president, because these would be representing the people. Remember, in a true democracy, citizens represent themselves. They literally go to the polls. An incumbent is voted out of office. Well, that incumbent is a politician. It is a representative. So the best answer would be citizens vote for taxes to decrease by 2%. And that would be, of course, implying that they go to the polls. You do have something like that today, which is called a referendum, where people can actually vote on something by just checking yes or no. You don't see it all that often, but it does certainly happen. And states certainly do provide citizens that opportunity, one that comes about on the ballot. So we're going to end here, and part 2 is next. Thank you for listening.